Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jasmine Navarez, Digital Content Coordinator here at Simulations Plus. Director of Alliance Management, Nate Musser, will introduce our speakers for today. In this webinar, Ian Haworth, Associate Professor at USC, and Noam Morningstar-kywi, Scientist here at Simulations Plus, will demonstrate how to use GastroPlus as an educational tool. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. We take your privacy rights seriously. By attending this event or participating in the Q&A session, you are allowing us to contact you. You are allowing us to contact you for follow-up. You may ask questions via the questions panel on your dashboard at any time. We'll address all questions in the Q&A after the presentation. The floor is yours, Nate.
Thanks, Jasmine, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Jasmine mentioned, I have the privilege today of introducing our two presenters. So Noam received his PharmD and Master's in Pharmaceutical Sciences from the U.S. School of Pharmacy. He taught in several computational drug design courses, including the use and application of GastroPlus and ADMET Predictor to USC and international students. Noam joined Simulations Plus as a postdoctoral fellow in 2021, where he now works to support the simulation studies, simulation technologies, and learning services departments. He has a passion for developing the software, applying models to clinical case studies, and training the next generation of users. Dr. Ian Haworth is an associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Pharmaceutical Sciences at USC. He received his PhD in physical organic chemistry from the University of Liverpool, UK, and then spent 3 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford, UK, before joining USC in 1992. His research laboratory has published more than 100 papers on modeling of molecular structure and interactions. He has a major role in teaching of medicinal chemistry and biopharmaceutics in the PharmD, PhD, and master's programs at USC. And he's lectured and taught those courses worldwide. So before we jump in, Jasmine, I'll let you introduce our first poll question.
Awesome, thank you. So our first poll question is, where are you in your GastroPlus journey? Are you a hatchling, nestling, or fledgling user? Okay, and then we'll give it a couple more seconds. I see answers coming in. All right, and we'll stop it there. So it looks like most people are beginners in the evaluation stage, and then followed by nestling, and lastly fledging. All right, we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Jasmine and Nate, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to thank Simulations Plus for giving us the opportunity to talk today. And what we're going to do is tell you a little bit about what we have been doing using GastroPlus as a teaching tool over the last year or so. And we'll certainly talk about some science. We'll have some science in the talk, but this talk really is given through an educational lens. So that's our real approach today. Although we are going to tell you what we have been doing, our real goal here is to show you what you can do, and hopefully we can show you how we can facilitate that. So that's a lot of the talk is aimed at that. I'm going to start off, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background and the course design. Noam's going to do the meat of the talk on the modeling that was done in the course, and we'll describe how we approach that. And then I'll come back at the end and talk a little bit about how we assess the course, and most importantly, how we assessed what we did and was it successful. So I don't need to tell everybody on the webinar that PBPK modeling is increasingly important. You're very well aware of that. I do think it's important to recognize that students are beginning to pick up on this. I'm seeing a lot more interest in this in our students at USC, and that includes, I think, critically professional pharmacy students. So for those of you not in the US, that is the PharmD degree, students training to be clinical pharmacists, but the training that they receive, I think, is really appropriate for PBPK modeling as well, with additional courses and further education. So it's not just masters and PhD, it's PharmD and in general, students training to be clinical pharmacists. The challenge here, though, I think, is in trying to teach PBPK modeling, really the student needs a good understanding of biopharmaceutics and pharmacokinetics to get the modeling. On the other hand, the PBPK modeling and in general computational methods, I think, have been shown for some time to enhance understanding of PK in particular, and perhaps biopharmaceutics. So you have a kind of a conundrum here that you need people to understand the science in order to appreciate the modeling. On the other hand, you need to train them to do the modeling in order to promote understanding of the science. So that's where we really started to think about our approach. And basically the challenge was, could we teach this at the same time? Could we teach scientific principles and software operation, GastroPlus, at the same time? And that was a fairly tall order. I hope we can convince you that we've actually succeeded in doing that. We have a model. And then the second thing is that, could we do it? That's one question. But then could we create something that would allow other people to do it using a similar method? So that's really what we're going to talk about. So Noam, if you could go to the next slide. So this is our broad principles of course design. I guess you could call these the course objectives. They're relatively obvious scientific principles. We'd like to explain pharmacokinetic and biopharmaceutic properties. That's what we'd like the students to get out of the course scientifically. Practically, we'd like them to be able to use GastroPlus and related software. And that means in a functional sense initially, switch it on, get a molecule in there, do something basic. But then we'd also like them to become much more sophisticated, to be able to build models, to apply the software to test those models, and begin to think about utilization of the software as a drug development and research tool. So the way we look at this is each overlapping pair of circles in this Venn diagram can be independent. So we can teach scientific principles, and we did to some extent in the course. And then we can have the students do basic software operation, predict parameters for things like pKa, solubility, so on. We'll get to that on the next slide. And then understand the predictions based on those principles. On the other hand, once they've got the basic software operation down, then they can start to actually do more advanced things. They can do simulation. But in order for that to be real, you have to be able to generate hypotheses for a model. And in order to do that, you've got to really go back to those scientific principles and understand the basis for those hypotheses. You can do each of these two pairs of circles independently, put it all together. Then our suggestion is, again, from an educational perspective, you are doing PBPK modeling. Clearly, you've got a lot to learn beyond that, but we are getting the student to the point where they can actually do that modeling. So let's go to the next slide, please, Noam. And this is now trying to make that a little bit more concrete. So let's take pKa, solubility, rate of solution, absorption. And here's midazolam. And this is a drug you'll be seeing a lot of in the next half an hour or so. And so scientific principles here, are thinking about this drug in terms of how will it ionize. Is it a base? Is it an acid? Clearly a base. Is it a weak base or a strong base? It looks like a weak base. We talk about that. How would its ionization affect solubility, rate of solution, and then a little bit more of an in vivo discussion of how might midazolam absorb, what are the kinds of parameters that would, in vitro parameters that would control that process in vivo. That's all the science. Now go to the software and think about basic ideas here. How do you get midazolam as a molecule into GastroPlus? Talk a little bit about SMILES strings, perhaps. And then how do you use GastroPlus to create very simple, initially, parameters, and how do you get those parameters out of the program? So you can see we've got a pH solubility curve there, and then does that pH solubility curve fit with the basic molecular parameters of midazolam? You see that it clearly does. The solubility is increasing at lower pH, below about pH 5, as the midazolam ionizes. And so that's the kind of discussion we could have there. Then the next step in all of this is go to a simulation and generate the curves at the bottom, and that's a rate of solution curve generated from GastroPlus in red, and an absorption curve in the light blue. And there we can talk about the idea of how fast the drug is getting into solution. You can see a little dip at the top as it begins to drop out of solution at a slightly higher pH. That gets us into a discussion of a little bit of physiology of the gastrointestinal tract. And then you can see that the light blue curve is separated from the red curve, and that gets us into the idea of permeability limited absorption versus rate of solution limited absorption. So lots of ideas there that we can talk about. And then finally, and I'm not going to get into this here, but we can then say, okay, let's think about other molecules. Let's run simulations for other molecules and clearly get different results. And now can we compare and contrast based on the different molecular structures? So that's a concrete example. If we go to the next slide. So this now is our first slide, really, where we talk about templates. And the theme of the talk from now on will be this template, because this is what I hope we will be able to offer to everybody else who wants to try to do this kind of course. And so this is the big overview. The template really has 3 parts. The first part is basic biopharmaceutics, compartmental PK, where we're using the simpler end of the software, predictions, generating an oral absorption model, and PK plus to do the compartmental fitting. Then we go on to a more complex discussion of metabolism and transport, and the kinetics of metabolism and transport. Start to think about how the physiology interacts with the drug disposition. And of course, that then leads to whole body PK models and simulation at that level. And then the third part is a more open-ended issue of saying to the students, okay, you know this process now, develop some hypotheses and test them. And that's very broad at this point, but we'll put in a lot of details. The other thing that's happening here is that we have a project running through the course. So the way we actually do this course is we give student groups a drug. In this case, we have 5 different drugs. We'll talk about a couple of them a little bit later, metformin and ibuprofen. The students are working on that drug all the way through the course. Initially in parts 1 and 2, they're doing basic parameter generation for that drug. Then they're doing in the part 3 hypothesis generation. We'll get to all of that. We do a pre and post assessment I'll talk about that at the end to assess the developing understanding of these physical, chemical, biopharmaceutical, and PK principles. And just to finish off this section, our implementation of this course was over 15 weeks. Each of these parts 1, 2, and 3, are about 5 weeks. And we had a mixture of MS, PhD, and PharmD students in the course, 19 students in total. So I think before I hand this over to Noam for the real meat here, we're going to go to, I believe, another poll. And here we'd really like to just understand who we're talking to, what kind of students you work with, because that's certainly an important issue.
Yep, so the poll is live now. I'll give it a few more seconds. All right.
Fantastic.
So it does look like most are not working with students, and then second would be graduate students.
And that's great. And I think that my comment here just quickly is that even though clearly I am working with students in a university, and that's the way we're thinking about the course, I think at the moment, but really this course I hope will be appropriate for educational settings beyond the university. So those of you who are not working directly with students, you may be working with other people who I hope would benefit from this kind of course as well.
All right.
Great, thank you. So I'll hand it over to you, Noam, for the next.
Thanks, Ian. So now we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. So here we have a more detailed breakdown of part 1 of the course, and it's a lot of text, but I'll work through some of it. Broadly, we have 5 different sessions where we covered these 5 topics. In our instance, each of these sessions was a week, but that can be adapted to whatever environment, what's appropriate for the environment and timeline that you are working with. Starting with an introduction, because these are potentially students that are not very familiar with PK modeling, or in some cases, they have a biopharmaceutics, some training in that, but not that much on more advanced PK. We move down to chem informatics, oral absorption models, compartmental pharmacokinetics, and then start working on having them present their results. Breaking this down, you can see that we have a scientific topic and a corresponding GastroPlus activity. And these are guided by the learning objectives over here on the right-hand side. And by learning objectives, what we mean is the skills that students are supposed to leave each of these sessions with. And these are designed pretty intentionally to be at a similar level between the science and the software, where these are interdependent, and they advance in parallel, building on each previous level. And so we can see that, at the beginning, we just introduce the processes and have them explain kind of the principles behind modeling, move towards getting both parameterizing a model with that information, but explaining how these properties scientifically, what you would expect for each property on the drug, make some predictions at a high level. Is this expected to be soluble based on the structure? What about permeability, distribution, and then use the modeling to explore that. And then as we get to more advanced topics within this first part, they're going to start doing more full model building and predictions, and using, making scientific predictions about what's going to occur, using the model to see if that's what happens, explain any discrepancies, and get into all these settings of the model, find the corresponding properties of the drug, and really see how it ties all together. And so to show a more specific example of that, we can look at the compartmental pharmacokinetics, where fundamentally we want students to be able to explain the relationship between absorption, distribution, and clearance. So if we start over here on the left, we have a 1-compartment model for an oral dose of midazolam. This is all from GastroPlus. This is the pure admit predictor. Properties down here, we have the compartmental parameters that were predicted by admit predictor, run a simulation, and this is the CP time profile and the summary statistics that we get out of that. And so For starters, this is really just software operation, right? As Ian said, just making sure you can open it up, load a drug, import the properties for that structure, and hit run simulation. But then it comes back to the science question of what does this all mean? For many of us here, this looks like a pretty typical CP time profile. We're familiar that we can recognize it, but the students aren't at that point yet, right? They might know what Cmax and Tmax is. That's pretty apparent. From this profile, area under the curve, they might know the definition of that. Of course, it's just what we see under the curve. But what's the relationship between volume and clearance and half-life, or dose and bioavailability, clearance and AUC? These are concepts that we need to work through. And we can do that in part by explaining, here's an absorption phase, a distribution phase, a terminal phase. Let's change our volume or our clearance or add another compartment, see how these change. But we don't want to do this purely in the abstract. We want them to get hands-on examples and tie it back to reality, real scenarios, and make it more concrete. And so if I move over to the right-hand side, where we have a 3-compartment model for an IV dose of midazolam that was fit to observe CP time profile using the PK plus module, which I'll come to in a moment, we see that we get a different set of parameters. This has now been fit to the data. It describes it well. And we can once again get into a discussion with the students, why do we see that this distribution phase is working well? And then we have the terminal phase. Why did we do this with IV data? That's a key teaching point of what is going on in each of these steps in the profile. What are the physiologic processes, and why can you use an IV data set to fit distribution and clearance better when you don't have to worry about absorption? When is absorption occurring? You can explore that with GastroPlus. Going back to the oral dose, if I want to explain why we want to use the IV model so that we're not checking distribution while fighting absorption, put up the absorption curve over the CP time profile, see the time points at which that's occurring to explain, even though we're having distribution and clearance here, those are the primary processes. Hey, look, we're still going to be having some absorption until 12 or 18 hours, whenever it ends. And that's really what I like about using the software to do this, is you can, I don't need a static image and then on the slide, go off on some tangent and try and explain the abstract. I can in real time have the students explore all these processes and prompt them to explore it on their own to answer their questions. And to that point, I want to point out, we have a lot of images on this slide, but they're all screenshots from GastroPlus. And that's reflective of how we like to do this course and how we would recommend that other people do it, because it's really a strength of using GastroPlus as a teaching tool. They get to do all of this in the software, explore it on their own, and it's interactive, hands-on application. And here in the middle, like I said, we have this fitting with PK plus an optional module in GastroPlus to fit compartmental parameters to observe data. And on one hand, this is pure software operation, right? We're teaching the students how to get CP time data into the program, run PK plus, fit it, get those parameters back into their model, and keep building out the model. That's really software operation. But at the same time, we don't just want them clicking the buttons without knowing what it means, right? This always comes back to the science, because you can tell the computer to fit it and get a result out, but does the result make sense? And we have, we fit it to the IV data here for demonstration purposes. I have it to 4 different sets of data in green, 1 IV, and then different doses of PO solution, 7.5, 15, and 30 milligrams of midazolam. And that's what we would prompt the students to look at, right? Okay, for the IV, of course, it does a good job. For the lower doses, it does a good job as well. But this fit compartmental model isn't working so well for the high dose. So what's going on here? What are the reasons for that? And in this case, it happens to be a nonlinear process that we have a saturation of metabolism that can't be captured with the linear compartmental model. And that leads us very nicely into the next part of the course, where we get into these more advanced topics of nonlinear processes, metabolism and transport, and the PBPK models. And so we have those topics here, followed by model refinement. Now here, as these are more advanced topics, we have 2 sessions dedicated to each of these. Again, for us, these were weeks. So week 6 and 7 in the course, weeks 8 and 9 were used for metabolism and transport, and then PBPK models. But the key point is really just as the topics get more involved, it may require more time to do. And then we dedicate some time after that just to keep working on model refinement, because of course that's an ongoing process. And so similar to before, we have our science topics, our GastroPlus activity that relate, we're talking about enzyme and transporter kinetics, Michaelis-Menten, and saturable processes, but also where are these transporters and enzymes located, and how do we incorporate that into GastroPlus and demonstrate that. Similar, more details about whole body PK, tissue distribution, different types of clearance, and how do we get that into the model. And same thing with the learning objectives. These once again advance in parallel. We want students to have the skill to characterize the contribution of molecular properties to distribution, clearance, elimination, and be able to compare and contrast this, by changing these inputs or using different drugs in the model. What is happening? Why is it happening? And these learning objectives not only advance in parallel, but they're getting more complex to represent the more involved topics as we move along. And of course, they're building on the previous skills that the students have picked up. So to look at a more detailed hands-on example of this, we have this slide once again with a lot of screenshots from GastroPlus. 2 different drugs to showcase 2 different examples. We have midazolam on top, metformin on the bottom. These were both drugs used in the course, midazolam being our instructor example, metformin was what one of the groups used. And so this is actually taken from one of the models that the students worked with and developed themselves. So midazolam up top, it's a CYP3A4 substrate in both the gut and the liver. And so we have our enzyme kinetics for midazolam, our Vmax and our Km values and the locations. In our model, this is the enzyme table from GastroPlus. Part of getting this in was learning about in vitro to in vivo correlations and how can we take in vitro metabolic or in the case of metformin transporter data and convert that to something that can be used in an in vivo model. Once it's in there, like I said, it's part of the liver. So here we have our PBPK diagram over on the right. It's complex again, but this is a really integral part of the software. But it's important to note that while this is complex, it's on one hand intuitive and representative in the sense that students who are familiar with physiology can see, okay, here's all these different tissues. Each of them is perfused. The blood has to through there. Okay, yeah, they mentioned that blood coming from the gut goes through the liver before entering systemic circulation. Now I can see that in front of me. So even though it's complex, it should hopefully at least be instructive in the physiology. And it's important to note, they don't have to know everything. They don't have to know what all these plasma parameters over here are to look at the details for the liver, see that, oh, hey, we have enzymes in the liver. Here's CYP3A4, some expression values pulled from the literature. And when we talk about, physiologic properties, tissue properties, this is another way in the software where we can use the software as a teaching tool and demonstrate the composition or component parts of these tissues. And then running that simulation for midazolam, not only do we have the CP time profile now with the nonlinear components in a PBPK model, but this green line is the amount metabolized in the liver versus the total amount metabolized. Where does that difference come from? Oh, hey, it's the gut. And using the capability to plot all these different series from a simulation in a hands-on real-time way as a tool to demonstrate to the students all of these processes. For metformin, similarly, a transporter substrate, cleared renally, both by filtration and active secretion, so we can blow up the kidney details panel. Has transporters, if we wanted to look at that, the way we did with enzymes up here. But some key parameters here too are glomerular filtration rate and clearance that comes from that filtration as a product of protein binding and filtration rate. And so that's a lot of good topics that we can discuss there as well. More scientific topics about just the principles of renal clearance, but again, demonstrating them in software. And then for the endpoint demonstration here, we have a plot of the concentration of metformin in this model, which again was actually built by the students in this class, in the kidney over time after an IV dose, and then the amount accumulating in the urine as well. And this is just one subset of the examples we can show for using this plotting as a teaching tool. Moving on to part 3 of the course, and this is really where the project moves from model building in the last 2 parts to model application. So we give students some prompts to apply their model. I'll get to that on the next slide, but the key points here really is scientifically, what is a hypothesis? Let's review that. How do you set up a hypothesis? How would you test it? More importantly, how do you set up a model to test that hypothesis? Let's go ahead and create that model and run those simulations, interpret the results, and ultimately, once you have that interpretation, really justify in a presentation the model that you've built and your conclusions from it. And that's a key point of these higher level learning objectives, is to not just build a model and get some results out, but to be able to interpret what they mean and justify why you think that. Because of course, at the end of the day, that's what we use modeling for in real life. So these were the prompts that we gave to the students for this third project. We set it up with a prompt stem. So one here focused more on the clinical pharmacokinetics. Is it going to be safe and effective if you start having physiologic changes in a certain population? Or more on the biopharmaceutic drug property side. If you change the formulation, the dose, co-administer it with food or an enzyme inhibitor, changes like that, how would it affect the ADME of the drug? And what we asked students to do, we gave them this list and said, all right, pick which ones you want to do. And for the, combine each stem with a special population here that's relevant to your drug. And that's what the groups for metformin and ibuprofen did here. Not shown, groups also had the 3 other drugs, amoxicillin, ibuprofen, and digoxin. And they each chose these prompts to use for their drug. You'll note that there were 3 prompts selected for metformin, 4 for ibuprofen. That's reflected of the different numbers of students in the groups. Metformin had 3 students in that group. The ibuprofen group had 4. So this was a way that we found to split the workload more evenly. So basically, it was 1 prompt per student. And each student worked on that prompt, but of course they were all using the same baseline model they had built and expected to check in with one another. And then same thing between the groups, they can learn about these different both scenarios and drugs during the final presentation or in-class discussions when the other groups are talking about their drug. And what we really hoped here was that these different prompts could cover different areas of the drugs. And that's why metformin, a renally clear drug, has renally impaired patients. Ibuprofen, CYP2C9 substrate, and so they chose this one. And so we're covering these different areas of biopharmaceutics and pharmacokinetics, and those 5 drugs that I mentioned, that's why we chose them. When we were talking about what drugs to assign, we wanted drugs that would cover all these areas: renal clearance, hepatic clearance, biliary clearance, enzyme substrates, transporter substrates, different clinical uses. And so the goal, you can really pick any drug or drugs for this course and find some of these prompts as well as activities that are applicable. But we were somewhat intentional about trying to expose students to as many diverse compounds as we could. So with those prompts given to the students, how did we prompt the students to explore their prompts? And that's what's down here in this box. Again, our goal here is to teach the students and give them hands-on experience developing a hypothesis. What goes into that? How do you build a model to test it? And so we can't just hand them these prompts and say, go at it, check back in with us 5 weeks later. This is very much a guided process. And so some of the prompts to prompt them to work on their prompts were, how do you set up a patient physiology to represent renal impairment? How do you try different dosing regimens? What I mean by try, both literally, how do you set that up in the software? Because sometimes you can have more complex dosing regimens than just changing from 15 to 30 milligrams, right? There's a time and a formulation component to that. But also, if you're checking if a drug's supposed to be safe and effective, maybe your results show it might be at a different dose than the main one, but change the dose and it's fine. How do you find that dose? What do you what's your stepwise process for exploring that in the model? Perhaps most importantly, what results are we looking for? Always you can get a CP time profile out, but is that really what we're interested in? If you're concerned about a toxic level in the liver. So what results are you looking for? How do you get those out of the software? And then for this first prompt stem, and to an extent for the second, how do you assess safety and efficacy? Because this all comes back to, the end user of these drugs are patients, and safety and efficacy is really important for our patients. And that's an area that really prompted the students to actually go out and look in the literature outside of GastroPlus for, hey, what's the toxic level for this drug? This other drug, what's the EC50? What do I need to get it to reach that concentration? You know, does this new simulation fall within the therapeutic range that I found? And so to go through some examples of how the students applied this, let's look, first at the metformin. Is your drug expected to be safe and effective in a special population of renally impaired patients? Of course, we know metformin, small drug, hydrophilic, charged, low protein binding, filtered well through the kidneys. It's also a transporter substrate. So renal clearance is going to be a major player for this drug, hence the renally impaired patients. Physiologically, how do we model that? Well, you can look up what renal impairment really means. It's a decrease in renal blood flow and by extension, kidney health and volume and filtration rate. So relatively straightforward to set up in a model. We go back to that tissue details panel for the kidney in our physiology and start to change these parameters. And the results that we get out of that, this is adapted from this student presentation for the metformin group. We have in these black squares our observed data for a 500 mg BID dose, CP time profile for the first 12 hours. Black line is their baseline model, which they got to describe it pretty well. And then we move on to the impaired population. So if they change that renal function, use the same dose, what happens? That's this blue line. And we can see that with reduced renal clearance, it starts to accumulate pretty quickly. And then this red line is the toxic level that was, or the upper end of the therapeutic range that was gathered from the literature for metformin. And the last part of exploring this, okay, so maybe not safe and effective at this dose, but what if we reduce the dose going from 500 mg twice a day to 250 mg once a day? And that's this green line. And hey, look at that. The exposure is pretty similar. Is that what we do in the actual clinic? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly this lends supporting evidence that that may be an approach. And that's the thought process that we want the students to go through. Just a second example of the same concepts with ibuprofen. In this case, looking at a somewhat abstract population of CYP2C9 reduced function patients. Very different drug, kind of the opposite in many ways. It's not a base, it's an acid. It's lipophilic, it's highly bound, hepatic clearance rather than renal. And a key point here is metformin is given pretty regularly in the treatment of diabetes, but ibuprofen, for any of us that have had to take it, headache, you might take it once, you're good. Sprained ankle, you might have to take it multiple times a day for a week. So different ways in which the drug can be applied. And in terms of the physiology, decreased enzyme expression or activity could both be used to represent a decrease in function. And that's kind of a key point on model building, right? Sometimes there are multiple ways to represent this. We could reduce the CYP2C9 expression in the liver, or we could go and just reduce the Vmax. And either approach technically could be used. It's really, can you justify why you used a certain approach, and balancing the most fully realistic approach with what is feasible in a model. And again, with the results, had a baseline model that was fitting the observed data pretty well. And then when we reduce clearance, 400 milligrams dose, single dose, what you might take for a headache, doesn't really change the peak concentration relative to the toxic threshold that they looked up in the literature. But as soon as you start to do repeat dosing, it can exceed that within 24 hours. And so just different ways that they can apply these models and investigate these. And at the end, again, present and justify their model and their conclusions. So with those more detailed examples, I'm going to pass it back to Ian. As we transfer, I'll launch another poll, and then Ian can move on to talk about assessment.
All right, so this last poll is, could you see yourself teaching similar material with support from Simulations Plus? And then I'll give it a few more seconds. All right, so it almost looks like we're at a draw across the board. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, lots of different opinions, and hopefully we can move everybody down into the yes category with a few more comments, but that's great. Thank you. So Noam, if you could just move on to the next slide. This is the real question here is, well, first of all, how did the students do? But maybe more importantly, how did we do? Did we really achieve what we were setting out to achieve? Because I think this was a challenge. So we did a sort of classical pre-post assessment, asked the students what they know before the course and after the course, except that we really wanted to focus this assessment on understanding. This is not a course that's meant to be testing rote memory, just the opposite. And so the way we did this is we came up with 12 questions, 4 in the physical chemical area, they're in red, 4 in biopharmaceutics in orange, and 4 in pharmacokinetics in green. Don't need to read the questions in any detail, but these are, I would say, characterize them as fairly difficult questions. In the pre-course assessment, we focused these on midazolam, and we gave the students the data set that you can see in the top right there. This is a series of data for midazolam. There's a pH solubility curve. There's a couple of CP time curves and some data on the effects of food and I think grapefruit juice on the pharmacokinetics. And we gave the students an hour to answer the 12 questions based off of these data. The answers were free format answers, a couple of sentences for each question. So not an easy test by any means. And then in the post-course assessment, we gave the students the exact same questions. So they'd seen the questions before, but what they didn't know was which drug they were going to get. In the post-course assessment, we used loratadine. I don't show you the data, but it was a similar kind of data set. So this really is not testing memory. We don't need them to know everything about midazolam. We need them to be able to interpret data. That's the goal. And as I said, we did that for loratadine. Free response answers. We have a very detailed rubric, which I'm not showing you, for grading of the questions, essentially scored on a scale of 0 to 3, 0, no correct answer, 1, identifying some basic idea associated with the answer, 2, describing it a little better, and 3, giving a proper explanation, brief explanation, but nonetheless. So each section from physical, chemical, biopharmaceutics, and pharmacokinetics were 12 points. It's just 4 questions times 3 points each. Possible score of 36 points on the whole assessment. So let's go to the next slide, Noam, please. So this is our results, and this is a pharmacokinetics talk. So we'll start with the population average of the students, and you can see that the oh, there we go. The pre-assessment, the physical chemical section, 7.7 out of 12 is the mean. Range of 1 to 12. So we have a very different group of students here, some with very good understanding of physical chemical properties, some with less understanding. Biopharmaceutics, 5.5, similar range. Pharmacokinetics, 4.8, again, a similar range. And those numbers, I think, were expected. We knew the students had a stronger physical chemical background. They'd already done some coursework in that area, but less so in pharmacokinetics in particular. We were really gratified to see that we got increases on the post-assessment in all 3 areas. And we, in fact, saw the biggest percentage increase in the weaker area in pharmacokinetics. So that really validated to us that we were able to teach the science through this approach. And I think we also understood we'd already taught the software because we could see the utilization of the software. So the totals, 18 out of 36 in the pre, to 25.6 out of 36 in the post, increase of 42.2%. So some significant learning there. Again, we wanted to look at individual differences in the classic pharmacokinetic sense, but these, of course, are pre and post course assessment. you can see that there really are two groups of students in the pre-assessment. The lower rating students who have less experience in that area, and then a group with much more experience. We'll see that both groups improved, which is nice to see that we were able to reach both the more knowledgeable students and the ones who have less knowledge in this area. A couple of students went down, but most people went up. And as I've said to Nolan, the next step here is to do CYP2D6 genotyping and try and figure out if there's a relationship. And so let's go to the next slide, and this is just wrapping this up. And so I hope that we convince you that we really can use PBPK modeling software and GastroPlus as a teaching tool, that we can promote understanding of science through that process, whilst also getting the students to not only be able to use the software, that's step number one, but also to use it in a real way, to actually start developing hypotheses and testing models. And that was our real goal here, to get the students to that point where they have an understanding of the real use of this software in a commercial sense and a regulatory sense, and so on and so forth. And so I hope we convinced that we did that. I hope we've inspired you to think about doing it yourself. We do have this course template that we've developed. I think that should help if you are going to implement something like this, because it will give you a step-by-step guide through the process. So I hope that it will assist other people in teaching the material, but the proof of the pudding, of course, will be if others do it. So we hope that we've inspired you to think about that. If we could go to the final slide, we'll come to questions in a moment, and the template itself will be available based off of the post-webinar survey, and clearly there'll be information from Simulations Plus and through University Plus if you're interested. But I do want to finish up by just talking about this photograph. We implemented this course in the spring semester of this year at USC, and really this was the semester where we were finally really getting back to campus, and so we had the students on campus, which was wonderful. But there were still some restrictions, and the university was trying to encourage classes to be given outside. So actually this whole course, or at least a good part of it, was done al fresco. This was al fresco PBPK modeling, and this is actually right outside the School of Pharmacy building. And you see there's Noam on the left-hand side engaged with one group. I'm there at the back on the right-hand side, the second group, and the back left, you can see Dr. Rebecca Romero, who's also involved in teaching the course, working with another group. And so here we are working outside. And I promise you, this photograph was not posed. In fact, I actually had no idea this photograph was even being taken at the time. But it caused a lot of interest, and you can see that we ended up winning the Photo of the Month award for January, which is not terribly substantive, but better than nothing. And this was for the USC School of Pharmacy Photograph of the Month. And so I think this hopefully gives you a picture of the way the course worked. It was very interactive, very dynamic, a lot of fun to do as well. And I would warn you, this was January 25th, so depending on where you are in the world, you might want to consider your options in terms of inside or outside. But even here, it was pretty cold, so you can see I got my sweater on there. Yeah, so I hope this gives you a sense of what we did in the course. And as I said, it was a highly interactive course. And so with that, I should also thank the students who really engaged in this course, and I think we've had good anecdotal feedback that they really did learn something. So I will stop there, and I guess we can take some questions.
All right, thank you guys. So I think the one of the primary ones to speak to, those that are interested in potentially setting these up and teaching, is around, whether or not the slides and related materials will be shared. So maybe we can talk about, how we can share some of the insights from today's presentation.
So I can
Oh, do you want
talk
to
to that first. Yeah, so I'm more than happy to both share the slides. More information on University Plus is here. We can send that as well to the question about will this provide free access for which yes, for academic use for qualified institutions, and to share the template. The post-webinar survey is really just going to ask if you want more information on University Plus and or the slides. So we ask you just fill that out, and then we have a good email list to get in contact with. Any other specific questions, of course, email the Simulations Plus email, and it can get forwarded to me as applicable, or Ian, your email's up here if you want to say anything.
Yes, and if anybody wants to just contact me directly and more on the academic side of this, I think that would also be completely fine. But I think the main approach will be to go through Simulations Plus to get access to the. We're very happy to provide this information in detail.
All right, thanks, guys. So one of the other questions that came through was, what are some of the specific challenges that you faced with, your students as you went through this process, and the different things that you shared?
Yeah, you want me to start that one, Norm?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the biggest challenge of all here was the amount of learning that's required. We did this course over 15 weeks. We had a 2-hour in-class session every week. It wasn't enough, really, but we made it work. But we really made it work primarily through Noam creating a very nice series of videos as well, which supplemented the learning. And so there has to be an expectation here of quite a lot of out-of-class work. I think, I don't know how many hours the students worked on this each week, but probably, I would guess, 5 hours at least per student. They are working in a group, so that's roughly 15 to 20 hours of effort each week across the group on the problem of that week. And so the videos, I think, were very important because they allowed the students to watch the video after the class and then do the work that we set. So that was a real challenge. Our students, I think, did a wonderful job, and they were able to get through the course quite well, but time was a big limitation. So that would be my comment. Nolan, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think with the time, one thing that's important to note about these types of courses is the open-endedness of some of these questions. I'm not talking about the open-ended project at the end, but even the open-endedness of building a model. That we can't let it. We learned to an extent the hard way not to let it be too open-ended during the model development process when you're trying to teach them about these different, whether it's fitting the right metabolic enzymes or different aspects of the PBPK model, that you can really try to refine the model ad nauseum in real life as well as in the course. And that's kind of a real life application thing as well. At a certain point, we need to know when to call a model good enough. And so that's the skill to pick up, I think. Also, picking examples where you kind of know generally the course the model should take is helpful in containing that, and you can play around with it, but at a certain point, you know what to say, that this is the way that I would do it.
Yes, and I've just add, because I think that's a great point, that the open-endedness is a real challenge. On the one hand, you want the open-endedness because in a way that's where the learning occurs. On the other hand, in an educational environment, you've got only a limited amount of time. Students only have a limited amount of skills. And so I think we are refining our thinking here in terms of trying to keep the open-endedness, but also have some idea of what's actually going to happen. And so I think that was a learning step for us in terms of offering the course, and we'll refine that as we go forward with this.
So another interesting one, and No maybe can speak to directly, but what are the prospects for the student by learning the software in the future?
Yeah, so there's really two sides to that, right? There's, while they're still in school, can they learn more of it, and then both how do they learn and use it after school within at least for our School of Pharmacy. We want to offer, this was an introductory course, we want to offer a more advanced or intermediate course as well. We haven't yet, but that's certainly one option that's on the table. And then we do have several students either that signed up with this because the course, or were already interested, to get involved in research projects, primarily with yourself, Ian, that we have through the University Plus program, we being in this context USC, the licenses that then the students can use outside of the class as a project for their learning, for their master's thesis, for their PhD. So those are options there. Outside of the course, either while in school or after graduation, there are really two ways they could use it. They could go into a job in industry at a company that uses GastroPlus, learn more there from some interest in industry, and use it in that job. Or there are certain, there are opportunities as well at Simulations Plus. I did a postdoc here before staying on as a full-time employee. There are internships available, as well as jobs for those with more experience. And I guess I would, either for anyone interested here or for students, those are available on our website, those opportunities.
And I would add that all those are great points, and the opportunities here are clear, and the students recognize it. The other thing I really think is it gets the students excited about biopharmaceutics and pharmacokinetics. This is real application, and I think a lot more interesting than just listening to me or anybody else talk about those subjects in a dry way. So this I think can be quite inspiring to the students, as well as practically useful from a career perspective.
Yeah, that's great. Here's another one sort of aligned with the software piece. It says one challenge of teaching with specialist software could be that software versions are frequently updated, and teaching materials also then need updating. How has this affected teaching with Sims Plus, or any comments on how you're mitigating for such changes?
So I think this hasn't been a major issue for us, in the sense that the interface has not really changed for some time, nor have the fundamental features. So in that sense, it's the same. The screenshots, the videos should be pretty applicable year over year, and that's just a facet of the way this software has been updated, at least to date. But also, I'd say most of the updates are adding new scientific features, and so for this is of course on the fundamentals, so that doesn't really change over time. But in a more advanced course, that would be something that if certain models, especially if we get into different dosage routes where the models are still developing for some of them and growing, that could be a challenge, but in a positive way, in the sense that it's adding more science. We haven't been faced with just anything like a major revamp that led to issues there. certainly something that could happen, but we've been fortunate not to have to deal with it.
That's a very good question, though, because that's always a concern, I think, that you just figure everything out and you're teaching it beautifully, and then suddenly everything changes, and now you've got to go back and do it. Yeah, very good point.
All right. Well, Jasmine, I know we're close to time. There are a few additional questions. Perhaps you want to close us out and then address where folks can find those additional answers.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to say thank you to all our attendees, our speakers, and then for any questions we didn't get to, we can post them on our social media with the answers. And then we also invite our audience to learn more about GastroPlus or other products and services on our website, as well as our University Plus program, which does offer 1-year access to Simulations Plus software to students and educators at accredited universities and then worldwide. So this webinar has been recorded for playback and will be available on our website and YouTube channel. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.